is email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Joining me today on the podcast is Howard Miller, Chief Information Officer at UCLA Anderson School of Management. Prior to joining UCLA, he was the acting CIO and CISO at the Columbia University School of Business, where he led both the information security and project management office functions. Leading up to his most recent career endeavors in higher education, Howard built an extensive background in IT, demonstrating expertise in the design, development, and deployment of strategy and policy. Howard, thank you so much for being on the show today.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. Happy to be here.
So I like to think of all the people who come on the podcast as kind of superheroes, and kind of just what's your backstory? You know, what got you from where you were in New York to UCLA?
Wow, superheroes is great. I look at this as the true working man story, right? It took a long time from, if I go back to the mid 80s when, I graduated with my MBA, was looking for that first job, started with a cohort of about 75, I'll call them kids right out of college, right? Doing entry-level programming in COBOL, to fast forwarding 25, 30 years later and actually achieving the goals that I set out to achieve, right? If you look at the master plan and you look at the education, and we were talking about this a little while ago, right? I've got a computer science degree. I've got an MBA. This was always the vision, right? And actually the thing now is, okay, what's next? I mean, I checked the box. So figuring out where to pivot next is part of the fun that's on my horizon. With that said, I think I took a very measured journey to get here. I've learned a lot along the way. I actually spent a few years outside of IT, which I think is a good thing for any of us to do in the IT field, just to sort of see how the other side lives. I spent 4 years in the corporate finance department, and after that, I knew IT was the rest of the way for me. So I think that's good. I've spent some time consulting. When I came in from consulting back into a full-time job, people told me that I had a consulting stain, and I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I just think there are a lot of lessons to learn along the way. We've talked about a little bit before that I've been on both coasts twice, right? There's definitely a difference between how business is done on the East Coast and how business is done on the West Coast. So I think when you all add that all up together, it's given me a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different backgrounds that make me who I am today.
So there's a term you don't hear much anymore, COBOL. So COBOL, and I guess the other one was Fortran.
It's a dinosaur. I get it, but that's where I started.
No, and I think I see that some legacy systems still use some of that legacy code in COBOL and Fortran. So it's crazy.
There was never anything wrong with it. We just figured out, like the Bionic Man, how to do things bigger, stronger, faster.
Right. What are some of the biggest industry shifts you've seen or experienced throughout your career then? It's going back from COBOL to now, but what are some of the bigger industry shifts?
Wow. Industry shifts is a fascinating word. I'm also not long on the term digital transformation, and I know that everybody uses it, and I know that it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I think if, I kind of fast forward to where I am today, and even if we take the term cloud, right? We could dissect cloud into just using somebody else's computer and be done with it and check the box. I mean, that defines what cloud is. But it's really been the evolution of software development life cycles and taking business requirements all the way to now doing things in a more agile way, doing things with low code, no code, doing things with automation. I mean, it's just a night and day difference between sort of where I started and where we are today. And sort of the theory to which I subscribe is just basically using technology the way that technology is meant to be used today. So, I'll give you an example, right? At the tail end of my time at Columbia, we were starting to implement chatbots, and chatbots have been around forever. And if you think about it, everybody hated the Microsoft paperclip, but it was probably one of the first chatbots, right? So, and you look at this theory of chatbots, and almost every website that you go to now has some form of virtual assistant there to help you, right? But at the end of the day, while we've probably as a society become less and less excited about talking to humans, and we would rather do something online first, the reality is if the machine can do something better, stronger, faster, if I go back to my Bionic Man real quick for that analogy, than the human can, and there's no strategy or value add for either the company or the employee in that scenario, then why don't we use the technology as the technology is designed to use today? So maybe that took a long road to get there, but I'm a firm believer in that.
I'm glad that you don't like the term digital transformation either. It always sounds kind of pretentious to me. So I'm glad to hear somebody in the space say that. Thank you. Do you think that AI has a role in this? Do you think that someday code will be writing itself?
I don't know that I've ever thought as far as the code writing itself, but I do think AI has a play here, right? If I look at my business today and what's most important to my business, it's about data. I was watching the NFL games last night, right? And they were running a commercial for AWS, right? And the premise started that inches matter, right? And then they quickly segued into, no, it's not inches anymore, it's millimeters that matter. And they talk about running 300 million computations, and I forget what that time parameter was, whether it was a second, whether it was a minute. I think it's irrelevant over that period of time. But those are the types of calculations, and those are the types of data points that within the last 5 to 10 years, anybody who's doing business the right way is starting really to understand the data they have and how to make sense of that data so we stop making decisions with our gut and start making the decisions on the trend. Now, for those who can see behind me, there's a lot of baseball stuff on the wall, and it's the other way. But if you look at baseball and the way baseball has even changed in the last 5 years, right? You used to just put a bunch of people out there. You say, I think the person's going to hit this ball this way, or you play a standard defense, right? Now, on every play, there is a player in a certain position because the data says, the trends say that this person is going to hit this ball here more likely than not. And I don't think that started the trend, but if I just follow with that analogy, right? Everything that we are doing today is based on data. So from an industry perspective, we have to do better with understanding the data we have, doing data analytics, doing predictive modeling, doing machine learning, doing artificial intelligence. So I think, listen, AI, ML falls pretty closely on that food chain behind digital transformation as buzzwords that, you would check the box on buzzword bingo. I think with that said, and we can get into the biases of AI and how the models could be, biased and whatnot, but I think AI is here. And I think AI, when used properly and applied the right way, is here to stay. I just don't know that I ever thought that AI would write its own code, but that wouldn't surprise me either.
So it's probably safe to still get a degree in programming. Still going to be okay there.
I think so. I mean, we talked a little bit about low code, no code before, but I think understanding the basics of programming language is still appropriate. I think it's still a logical skill. I think if you were asking me if I were going to coach somebody who wanted a field in technology on where to go, I would likely say cybersecurity 1, data science, data analytics 2, or they could be 1A, 1B. But I think going back to basics and understanding how anything started foundationally is always going to be a value, regardless of whether it's programming or anything else we do in life. So to that point, to that question, absolutely.
Yeah, I think when the cloud, for the cloud, as you said, became a popular term, I didn't know what it meant at first. I was talking IBM in the cloud. I have no idea. And then I was working with a client and she said, we did this 20 years ago. We got away from the cloud. We had servers and dumb terminals. And she said, now we're going back. So.
Yeah. Well, when I got to Columbia, I didn't even realize that we were doing things that were cloud and SaaS applications. We were just pulling out what we considered to be legacy or outdated applications and just doing them a better, faster way. And they were SaaS and they were in the cloud, but it's not like we were going around telling people, hey, we're leading a cloud journey, right? We were just doing what made sense for business. And in that case, it made sense to do it, in a cloud native way or in a SaaS application way where you didn't have that footprint on your site.
Yeah, I know I'm definitely dating myself here, but when I was the first college courses I took in programming were at Old Dominion University. When I was in the Navy and I was home, if I was going to be in port long enough to go to school at night, I would do that. And during the day, I would hang out with the programmers on board the ship they were still using reel-to-reel tapes. And then my first programming class at night at Old Dominion was punch cards. So things have changed a little bit since then.
Absolutely. We got those old green printouts. I'm probably in a similar demographic to you, so I get it. We talked about how things evolve, right? Clearly things evolved. I mean, there are people still running applications on a mainframe. I mean, you wouldn't have thought, or you likely wouldn't think. I've got a peer of mine who's still trying to retire a legacy AS400, right? Those beasts still exist in business. People want to pull the plug on them. That you can't find the skills very easily to maintain them anymore. They were good at its time, right? There's still value, but it's not what's meant to be done today.
No, it's like keeping a 55 Chevy running versus going out and buying something that's got a lot more bells and whistles and runs a lot faster these days.
And it's I'll tell you anecdotally a funny story because it's an interesting model, right? So, I lease cars now. I typically don't buy them because, in that analogy, the technology, we go back to the technology and the technology changing, right? So my brother was teaching his daughter how to drive, and she was in a 2005 car, and she backed up and she hit something. And she got mad at my brother because she said, I wouldn't have had this accident if you had a newer car that had all of the safety features, right? Now, you and I didn't learn how to drive that way. My brother didn't learn how to drive that way, but think of that from a user perspective, right? The user said that this wasn't on me. If the vehicle was smart enough to know I was going to hit something and told me that, maybe I wouldn't have hit something. And think about how fascinating that really is, right? And that goes back to 55 Chevy. That goes back to lease versus buy. It goes back to the question you asked me earlier. The technology changes so quickly,
right?
If you look at iPhone V1 versus what the iPhone can do today, night and day different. That's 15 years ago. Technology changes just so quickly that if you don't evolve, the technology is going to evolve much quicker than you are, and you're just going to be left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's kind of continue that trend. So I'm going to ask you to put on your forecasting glasses. And what do you think is going to happen in the next 10 years? Where do you see things going?
Well, it's a great question, right? We've talked a little bit about our demographics and aging ourselves, right? But, if you look at Get Smart, for example, right? He had a shoe phone in 1965. I mean, he had the first mobile phone. We never give him credit for that unless you want to go back to Dick Tracy. And I'm going somewhere with this, so just humor me, right? I grew up in the era of the Flintstones and the Jetsons, and the Flintstones were prehistoric, but the Jetsons were very futuristic, right?
Yep.
And, I thought we'd have Foodaracacycles, and I thought we'd be flying little cars around, and, maybe drones are there. Maybe that's not, I still think we're going to see that sometime. I hope to see that sometime in my lifetime, right? We talk about Internet of Things was really big for a while. We don't hear so much about Internet of Things anymore. But it's still there. It's still prevalent. We talk about autonomous vehicles. We talk about smart cities. I think the technology, and you asked about artificial intelligence writing its own code. I mean, that it's a little bit of a prognostication. I think things will continue in a way where the technology will just continue to evolve into things that we can't even see or predict. I'm not going to go far as Uber was the master disruptor, right? But I think there are a lot of things that are around the corner that we just can't see yet. I've attended a lot of presentations on Web3 and metaverse, and we've heard about NFTs, and we talk about blockchain, and we talk about quantum computing. I think there are people that are doing some neat things with all of these technologies. I'm not sure that I understand them well enough or have spent enough time exploring what they really mean to know how impactful they will be. So while I'm generally a little bit skeptical, there's likely still a play for some or most of these things moving forward. I'm not sure that my magic 8-ball or that my crystal ball tells me much more beyond that, but I think some people are betting on the metaverse being a reality. I mean, I've got my Oculus back here. I've explored it a little bit. It's really kind of neat. I remember a couple of years ago, I was at a peer school here in Southern California. I was at Loma Linda University. And I put on a headset, and they were using that to teach medical students sort of anatomy and biology, right? And the things that can do are, the possibilities are endless without sounding overly cliche. So I think we will continue as a society to explore and to push the boundaries with technology that we know exists today, or that's right there on the precipice. But I don't know that I can see much further than that.
Yeah. And certainly we have come a long way, and I was going to get to this later, but you and I are, you're predominantly in the higher ed space. And as I mentioned offline, I do teach some at Georgia Tech as well in the exec ed program. And I'm a big people person, so this is always challenging for me. When we teach things virtually, I don't get the same interaction or feedback system. Like most of the time people come on the course, they turn their picture off and they mute themselves. And it's like talking to a blank screen. I don't know if you're engaged, not engaged. And then I envision the future, maybe going back to your Oculus. You have your virtual avatar and you're using your Oculus. And do you think that's a trend for the future for higher ed, or do you think it's going to be this hybrid blend going forward?
So I'll say two things. I think we're trying to explore what the possibilities of AR, VR can mean for us. I think there is a play for it. Again, this is higher ed, so can I tell you specifically what use case? I mean, I'll go back to blockchain for a second. I think it's great technology. Maybe other than just verifying a transcript, I'm not sure that it has a great play in higher ed. But I think all of these technologies with the right people and the right thought leadership behind it probably have a play in the space. I'm not sure I know exactly what that is yet for higher ed. To your question, right? And you talked about this with me a little bit offline beforehand, right? When you did your master's, you had a hybrid experience, right? Hybrid experience has been around for a while. The pandemic demonstrated to us that we could actually teach that way. My institution is such that we are entirely predicated on an in-person experience. And, almost to a person, everybody would have told you 2 to 3 years ago, this is nuts. We're not going to do Zoom. We'll use hybrid to the best of our ability. We want in person. Coming out of the pandemic, what we found is that while people still, generally speaking, want that in-person experience, there are things about the hybrid one that they like. So if they don't feel like rolling out of bed at 8 o'clock, or they just want to tell us they have COVID, whether they do or they don't, because they don't want to come in, and because it's convenient, they accept that as a method in which to learn. So there is a convenience factor to it. Some people consume easier that way. As you said, I think we've, to a fault, started to multitask too much, so that you lose the value of that in-person experience and being able to read body language and being able to talk to things organically. So do I think there's a place for it? Yes. Do I think my institution's ever going to go there all in? Absolutely not. So then it comes back to what is the right use case or use cases for being able to do that. And it almost goes back to where we were before the pandemic, right? If it's a matter of convenience, if you don't always need to be on campus, if you're consuming a certain type of content, I mean, if I hate to say it this way, I'm not looking to demean anybody who talks in front of a room, but if you're going to put up a bunch of slides and talk to a bunch of slides, and that's what your class is, I mean, you probably could have done that asynchronously anyway before the class, right?
Yeah.
Here's the material we're going to cover today. Here's a half an hour worth of slides. Go consume it yourself, right? I think the days of in the classroom where that's the best utilization of both the academics perspective, the person who's teaching, and the people who are in the room consuming, that probably is something that can be disrupted, right? But if you're actually going to use that class time for case studies, interactive discussion, breaking up into breakout sessions, then yes, by all means, I don't think hybrid is well suited for that. So again, that's a long answer, but hopefully that got to the point you were looking to get to.
No, that's perfect. I think that's one of the challenges that I see is a lot of the group exercises. If everybody's virtual, I know you can break them out into breakout rooms and things like that, but it's not quite as good as when you're face to face and you're elbow to elbow and having the conversation. So definitely see that. Now, you started off your career as an IT professional in biotech. At least that's what I read on LinkedIn. So tell us more about, what got you from there to higher ed, or maybe that's when you took your side trip to finance and came back. I'm not sure.
No. So listen, getting out of college, it was finding any job. I found my way into pharma back in the mid 90s. Was always looking to grow my career. Back in 1998, I consider my career to have gotten its first big break, right? I hopped on an SAP project. And again, that dates me for sure.
Yeah.
But that was in 1998. If you weren't on an SAP project or you didn't know anything about SAP, that was the place to be, right? So I sort of lobbied that project and that experience to some international travel, to really ramping up some consulting skills. to trying to advance my career. And ultimately, I parlayed that into a consulting gig, right? And I loved consulting. I think if you haven't consulted if I go back for one quick second to SAP, I tell my people this all the time. If you haven't been on an enterprise project like an SAP project from end to end, where you're up at midnight and any change that you make here in an integrated system affects all the way down there, you actually don't really understand IT, because I think those projects are fabulous. We're teaching IT professionals how actually an organization works from end to end, not just an IT organization, but an organization works from end to end. But I parlayed that into a consulting gig, and I loved consulting. At the time, my kids were younger. I was traveling about 100% of the time, and that was a recipe for divorce. So I came back off the road, and that's when I landed in a corporate finance department, not necessarily because I wanted corporate finance, but A, because I needed to come in off the road, and B, at that time, my skills were very much so that, I've gone back to, I have a computer science degree and an MBA, right? I had done financial systems for the first 10 to 15 years of my career. So landing in a corporate financial department, being in charge of a financial system, wasn't too far of a stretch from being in IT. But by the same token, and I tell people this all the time too, when you work for a corporate controller and you give somebody a spreadsheet, you understand how to bridge from the previous slides that you presented to the current slides, and you make sure that every dollar foots. Right. And I think those lessons are still invaluable today. So there are things that you learn from being on the business side of things that you don't appreciate from an IT side. But again, the mindset is different. The way in which the organization runs is different. I think when you experience that and you know who you are, I just knew that the technology would be the right place for me. So I pivoted. Still in the same vertical, but to an IT project manager position. And that's when I started in a PMO. That space was wrought with mergers and acquisitions. And so around 2008, my company was being acquired. And I give the CIO who was in charge a lot of credit at that point. I had been working on, as I said, PMO and projects. I had worked on Sarbanes-Oxley remediations, and I started to dip my toe into the IT compliance space. And I know Sarbanes-Oxley is another thing that dates me, and I'm okay with that, right?
Me too. I'm with you.
But I parlayed that into an IT compliance and ultimately an IT security pivot. And when they closed my company in Connecticut and offered me an all expenses paid trip to San Diego, it was on the guise of IT security and IT compliance, right? So now we've sort of parlayed, a little bit of consulting, a little bit of SAP, a little bit of financial systems into PMO and security and compliance. And when you introduced me, you talked about the things that when I got to Columbia, which was in 2012, that was my pivot to higher ed. I'll come back to that in a second. What I was asked to do was to stand up a PMO and to stand up an InfoSec organization. So it was that work that I had done in the last, 3 to 5 years, 5 to 7 years, that set me up for that career in higher ed. So the pivot to higher ed isn't really all that fascinating a story, but I'm going to, help you connect the dots here anyway. So as I mentioned, pharma, life tech, life sciences, all of biotech, mergers and acquisitions all abound. That acquisition that got me moved to San Diego, I was on the quote unquote losing side of that. So I wasn't on the acquiring side. So I think most people that were on the acquired side of that were not necessarily, going to get that chance to stay around and advance their careers with the, winning entity. And so I was assigned to a special project that became more and more special as we went along and continued to spin its wheels in quicksand. So I kind of got the sense that that job wasn't going to be around forever. And I connected with the gentleman who was the CIO on the losing side of the merger to begin with. And he had landed at Columbia. And he offered me the opportunity to be a deputy CIO and to stand up an InfoSec org and a PMO org. So it's less about that mission to be in higher ed, but more about looking for something that was a little bit more stable, with a little bit more responsibility, and leveraging the work that I had done the last 3 to 5 years. And so for all of those reasons, other than the fact that it was in New York, it was a good fit.
Well, I would pick a bone with you on the fact it wasn't interesting, because I'm as somebody who graduated with a degree in electrical engineering who then does project management for a living for the last 30 years. I'm always interested to see how the transitions happen, because that's, and I was also in your role as well as a consultant, traveling 50 weeks a year on the road with my 2 weeks vacation, and married, and that did lead to divorce. So and I was traveling quite a bit again. And now I have 2 kids, and if there was one silver lining for me out of COVID, it was that I got to spend the last 2 years really pretty much. I think I traveled maybe 8 weeks in 2.5 years. And I have a 15 and a 12-year-old. So having that time with them was really super important for me. It's, even though I didn't know I was missing it, I really was missing it. So another one that I'll throw at you, because there were about 5 or 6 things that you were talking stuck in my head I wanted to ask about, but another one, buzzword. So SOX is one, Sarbanes-Oxley. How about Y2K? I remember working on a Y2K project when everybody thought the world was going to come to an end at midnight on December 31st, 1999. So, it's another one of those, we dated ourselves projects.
We scrambled. It ended up being non-eventful.
Thankfully.
I don't recall. I recall time and energy around it. In retrospect, I don't remember that being as sort of all-inclusive or all-intrusive as some other things that we've worked on.
Mm-hmm.
But
I happened to be on a big one at Coca-Cola at the time, and Accenture, I think, was the consulting firm involved, and it was pretty intensive from their perspective. The other one that you mentioned about, if you haven't done a system-wide engagement like an ERP and don't realize it's something you do here is going to have an effect way downstream, it actually ties in very well with your work in the project office, because that's the same thing that happens in a project, right? A critical path of a project where you make a change early, they can have a negative impact, 9-10 months later. If you don't understand that connection, you might think on the front end, well, we got a year, that's plenty of time. And those poor people in test at the very end of the project are the ones that just get squeezed every time because they get delivered too late and the deadline doesn't move. And then they get, they're working 80 hours a week.
Or the security folks who weren't involved from the beginning and then said, yeah, see if this thing is secure, right? So yeah, there's a whole lot of that. I get it.
Yeah, for sure. So let me go back a minute ago to the previous question. We're talking about kind of pivoting to do offline, hybrid, et cetera. And you've said that probably you guys will never go fully remote, which I'm a big fan of that as well. I like the at least hybrid approach. But I read some of the articles that you had interviewed on, and there were some challenges. Even today, where professors are having challenges in how to still deal with that, how to give tests even. What are some of the challenges do you see in a hybrid environment for higher ed?
I think, as you mentioned, right, I think there are some use cases to which it lends itself very well. And I think in a lot of cases, the work that we do, it just doesn't, right? So I think it's equally as about the student as it is about the faculty. You mentioned it earlier. I know other faculty who've said, I just don't want to teach in this format. I'm okay teaching all Zoom and I'm okay teaching all in person. And it's hard for the faculty. So it's hard for the faculty member to manage. And I'll explain it this way, right? Forever, faculty, by and large, just taught in person, right? And faculty got good about teaching in front of the room. And then you couldn't teach in front of the room anymore. So we asked them to learn Zoom. They all learned Zoom. And they got reasonably good at teaching on Zoom. And now we threw them another curveball and said, well, you got to manage some people who are in a room and you got to manage some people who are on Zoom. And they just threw their hands up and they said, no, that's enough, right? No, I'm just not going to do this. I can do this well. I can do this well. Much like you said, are you staring at a blank screen, right? Well, who am I teaching to? Am I teaching to the room? Am I teaching to the Zoom? Who's watching the chat? I mean, it's a lot. It's more than walking and chewing gum at the same time. There's a lot to manage in that environment for the faculty member. And to be fair to the faculty, it's a big ask. There aren't many that have really made that transition and have figured out how to manage it really well. Right. And I think therein lies for me the largest issue, right? It's just a big lift to both execute the class that way and then have material that really resonates for both audiences. So I think for me, that's sort of the number one challenge with the premise, right? It's just a big ask on the pedagogy. It's a big ask on the human element to be able to manage all of that. Yeah.
Now, when you made that shift, which had to be abrupt because everybody kind of went virtual at the same time, it feels like, what did you guys do well? And then in retrospect, what would you have done differently this time?
Well, as you said, it was a huge fire drill, right? It's not like we had a lot of time to prepare. I don't think if you go back to that time period and ask anybody if you thought we could successfully execute it, or ask most entities if they thought they could successfully execute it, that you would get a, yeah, we think we can do this well, right? I think we all just sort of went with the flow. We leveraged some of the faculty who had taught, like yourself, in a hybrid format before to sort of train the trainer. We tried to do a lot of upfront training. Unfortunately, what we find with faculty is they're sort of hit or miss. They sort of enter the fray when they want to enter the fray, and they're way out on the outskirts until they find it's time to enter the fray. So trying to do something proactively with them and say, this is what your future looks like, didn't really work as well as we had hoped. We recorded a lot of videos for them to consume. Again, we've talked about, is that a modality of which some people like to consume? I'm not sure that was ever really a big hit for them. So we had to do a lot of handholding, admittedly. And that is part of the culture that comes along with, at least in the two business schools I've been at before, that the culture is such that it's very much for both students and faculty, very high touch. I've got another word for it, but we'll just stick with high touch for now. And it's not a bad word. It's just another description, right? But we'll go with high touch, right? So all of our clientele, all of our customers, even if you want to call it that way, and we can argue what a customer is. I don't know that we necessarily want to dovetail into that right now, but they expect high touch. And so we had to put a lot of time, energy, effort, and focus into a lot of just-in-time, one-on-one training. Now, the good news is that it worked. The bad news is that IT has not really been off since March of 2020. We've been on this constant on. If I go back to my ERP, right, I would tell you higher ed felt a lot more corporate for me as of March of 2020 than higher ed ever felt before. It felt normal to me. It's a big shift for people who've not worked anywhere but higher ed, right? And that to me is the biggest difference, right? So it's a lot of high touch, a lot of in-person hand-holding, getting people through it. And that actually wears on an organization.
Yeah, there's no end date, right? I mean, it's like with the ERP project, there's traditionally an end date coming up, but this is just
usually if it doesn't slide, right? And
yeah.
We are starting to see signs. We ran a big in-person event the other day, and people commented on the fact, so here we are in November of 2022, that it was nice to actually do a full end-to-end in-person event. So maybe the pendulum is starting to swing a little bit so that some of that burnout and being always on because of the things that we had to do for the pandemic, maybe slightly a thing of the past. I think with that said now, the bar is raised, right? IT prior to the pandemic at my institution was really viewed as nothing more or less other than an operational organization. We are now strategic, right? We are involved in strategic. We continue to do strategic things during the pandemic. But again, that puts a different kind of churn and a different kind of strain on the organization, because the expectation is that you still do things operationally well. Yet, as we talked about at the beginning, technology is changing. I don't want people coding in C#+ anymore. I don't want to build stuff. I'd rather buy stuff, right? Because that's what most organizations are doing, and not all. And I get it's a very broad brush approach to the solution, but traditional SDLC isn't really here anymore. It was one of the first things on my board when I got there 3.5 years ago. I didn't put any time on it, right? We're talking agile. We're talking product managers. We talk MVPs, right? We're trying to pivot to the way that it seems that business is working now, because the pace has picked up. The speed is a lot more rapid. We don't even have the luxury anymore of actually going at the pace of higher education, which has traditionally been glacial compared to industry. It's picked up.
Well, that wraps up part one of my conversation with Howard Miller, CIO at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. Coming up in part two, we'll discuss why it's important to invest time in people.
Business relationships matter. So when I got to UCLA, I spent the first 3 months doing nothing other than just talking to people, right? You find pretty quickly that when you actually engage and you talk to people and you listen, just establishing the fact that you need to get people to talk to each other, right? And you need to understand how people work and how they operate. And that has been key to my success at UCLA, because I invested the time in people.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.